Over the last couple of days, some fascinating articles have come out about Russia's economy, describing it as on the edge of a cliff or a house of cards. I will share links to all these articles in the description of the video, but here is a summary I've put together of their contents. And I think, given the amount of discussion we've had about the Russian economy in past videos, you will find this interesting. We cannot say when the Russian economy will collapse or even if it'll cave in a single dramatic moment. But what's not under doubt is that pressure on Putin's economy is building. It has even been termed a house of cards in a recent article in the Financial Times. All this pressure makes Putin's war economy less sustainable, his regime more brittle, and the outcome of events far less certain or indeed predictable. And if you're a tyrant, then things you cannot control, unpredictability, in fact, is the thing that you do not want to see in your realm. According to the Atlantic Council, Russia is feeling the full impact of sanctions, and the strain could force an end to the war this year. Economic pain will intensify after nearly 3 years of full-scale war. The think tank pointed to pressures building on Russia's economy. Western sanctions are a primary cause. And Mark Timnicki, an Atlantic Council fellow who's been on this channel before more than once, suggests that those measures have had an impact on Russia's economy. Whether the regime and its propagandists and useful idiots in the West want to shrug them off as insignificant or not. The various sanctions packages, including measures such as cutting Russia off from the SWIFT network, the international financial communication system, as well as trade restrictions on several of Russia's key exports like oil and gas. But the trouble is loopholes and a slow approach to implementation of those sanctions mean they are not as effective as they could be, and the impact has taken a very long time to become noticeable. 3 years later, the picture looks different, says Mark. The Russian economy is now beginning to see the full effects of international sanctions. If these trends continue, then the full impact of these financial punishments, combined with strong Ukrainian resistance to Russian forces, could at last put enough pressure on the Kremlin to end its war, says Timnicki. There are various signs of economic strain in Russia, which lead to this idea that Putin may not be able to continue his imperial war at the current scale for much longer. Inflation is one. The ruble has plummeted more than 50% in value against the dollar and the euro over the last year, partly due to sanctions pressure, but also because of the vast amounts of money pumped into the military-industrial complex and inflated wages of those working within it, and into the hands of soldiers and the families of deceased soldiers. Even Putin acknowledged Russia's inflation rate is alarming, but he may seek to place the blame on subordinates and on external factors. He will not admit it's likely that his war was to blame ultimately for the inflation and the economic problems that we're seeing. Putin's points on inflation were telling, says Mark. The Russian leader seldom discusses problems pertaining to Russian society. Thus, the fact that he felt the need to acknowledge inflation as a serious issue suggests that something greater is afoot, says Timnicki. A technical recession is looking likely in the Russian economy for 2025, but those figures may well be covered up. The books may be cooked by Russia's central bank and government. 2. Russia's energy businesses, many state-controlled or state-owned, appeared to be struggling after the steep imposition of trade restrictions and declining oil prices. Russia's energy revenues fell by nearly a quarter in 2023, with projections running to 2027 suggesting that oil and gas revenue will continue to decline, even if there's a partial easing of sanctions. Thirdly, the Russian budget is clearly coming under strain. We've spoken on the channel before with Konstantin about the real risks of Soviet-style stagflation returning to Russia. Putin and the Kremlin will have to determine how to address these financial woes. This suggests that 2025 will be a difficult year for Russians and the economy. Time will tell how significant these events will be, Timnicki added. So what are the hidden costs of Russia's war, driven bubble economy. For some, the Russian economy has repeatedly defied expectations. Predictions of a double-digit contraction after the full-scale war began did not materialize. On the surface, driven by the huge influx of money into the war economy and burning of a vast sovereign wealth fund or war chest, apparently the Russian GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023 and is anticipated to post 4% growth in 2024. Key indicators like GDP growth, household income, and low unemployment have become things that Putin can brag about, and propagandists wax lyrical over, but they belie some serious issues, not least the shortage of skilled and unskilled manpower across strategic industries. Putin presents these economic numbers to partners in Asia and Africa as evidence of Russia's sound economic policies and the resilience of its development model. Chinese officials may be convinced, having reportedly established an interagency commission to study Russia's economic model. However, this does not explain why the Chinese have systematically withdrawn credit support for Russian industry, parts of the Russian state, and from consumer markets as well. According to Alexander Prokopyenko of the Moscow Times, this image of resilience is deceptive. Over the past 2 years, Russia's economy has operated like a marathon runner on fiscal steroids, and now these steroids are wearing off. He points to the slowing of growth and the increasing challenge the Russian government must fund social and infrastructure programs. The Kremlin faces the mounting challenge of sustaining the war effort and simultaneously maintaining low inflation, he explains. Without significant course corrections, the current momentum may falter within a year. That means Putin may need to find a way to put the brakes on or at least freeze his war in Ukraine. Russia's economy has relied on a unique combination of factors to sustain its war effort. Record hydrocarbon export revenues enabled by the construction of not only a vast grey fleet of tankers, but an entire shadow trade network to launder its blood oil trade. Strict centralized governance and a lack of public consensus requirements have also played a key role. Putin understood early on that it was better to let the discontents and dissidents leave rather than force them to stay in Russia and fester and cause trouble. The question is not if the cracks will spread in this economic facade, but when. A crumbling economy has a profound impact on the Kremlin's capacity to project power, as we saw when Putin failed to prop up the Assad regime in Syria. Might we see an ejection of Wagner and Russian proxies from sub-Saharan Africa too? A weak economy may also affect the regime's ability to maintain internal stability. But what we see of the issue in budgetary numbers, the officially released data, may be only part of the story. The rapid expansion of government spending, which we detailed above, has been the primary driver of Russia's recent economic growth and contains both budgetary outlays and state-subsidized loan programs, the scale of which are not so clear. From 2022 to 2024, the fiscal stimulus amounted to over 10% of GDP, while preferential loan portfolios in the banking sector surpassed 15 trillion rubles. That's $150 billion. Industrial facilities are operating at 81% of capacity, and 73% of enterprises report labour shortages. So whereas the low percentage of joblessness is touted by propagandists and useful idiots, this is not a good thing in reality. The people that operate these enterprises or who are needed for growth are either fighting in Ukraine or are never coming back from there. An estimated 1.6 million jobs are unfilled. The domestic economy cannot meet the demand driven by aggressive state and household spending, which drives up imports, which for certain goods are harder or more expensive to source because of the sanctions regime and the need to import via intermediary countries. Struggling industries are lining up for state assistance, but the war industries are the ones that get prioritized. Automotive manufacturing, non-food retail, and housing construction are all experiencing issues, with large players in these markets on the verge of bankruptcy. Wage growth is most pronounced in industrial regions such as the Kurgan region, which contains Russia's sole producer of armoured personnel carriers. This creates localized risk when businesses are in financial trouble and difficulties sourcing labour in these distant areas, as well as an intensification of the wage inflation spiral. The greatest losers in Putin's overheating economy are core supporters, public sector workers, including teachers, doctors, law enforcement personnel, and pensioners. The same people, in fact, who suffered most during the collapse of the Soviet command economy, or those at least who had the highest fall of wages and status during that chaotic period of change. Their wages are tied to the official inflation rates of 9%, but real inflation for many households on essential goods is between 20 and 28%, it's been suggested. Defence and security spending will exceed 8% of GDP and account for 40% of total federal expenditure. That is a record not seen since the Cold War. Contract soldiers represent a significant part of the budget, with the army requiring 20,000 to 30,000 new recruits monthly. It's no wonder that North Koreans are sought after. They are likely cheaper than domestic cannon fodder. Average enlistment bonuses now stand at 1.1 million rubles, that's $11,000, with annual incomes ranging from 3.5 million to 5.5 million rubles. That's $34,000 to $53,000, depending on region and unit. This is a huge injection of money into Russia's provinces and a scale of income many of the families of soldiers will never have seen before in their lifetimes. Inflated sums reflect the shrinking pool of willing recruits. Direct federal spending on new recruits alone is estimated at 1.6 to 2.4 trillion rubles. That's 16 to 23 billion dollars, not including additional costs for wounded soldiers and compensation for families of the deceased. These figures are, of course, an estimate obtained from collating various sources of official and unofficial data. And here lies a reason why Putin may not want to end the war anytime soon. Soldiers will be among the first to face cuts, with over 3 million people and their families directly affected by military service. Reductions in income will impact a significant portion of the population. Add to this the benefits that accrue as the role of patriots in the war and social status they've obtained. This is an explosive set of things that they are in line to lose, plus little in the way of a healthy civilian economy to compensate if the war ends. This could be an absolutely explosive situation, and the risks of withdrawing support for veterans also create significant issues. Massive payouts to soldiers and the broader surge in wages have led Russians to feel that their standard of living has improved. It's one reason why there's little resistance to the war. Why protest when you're doing okay out of it? Well, that is the kind of immoral logic that actually many people may have. Instead of freedom and uncertainty, at least 40% of Russians would trade personal freedoms for state-provided salaries and pensions, according to one study. There's a good reason that Russia did not experience a Maidan-style revolution. Dependency wins out over dignity. Prokopyenko suggests a paradoxical impact of the war if it's frozen, or if indeed Ukraine wins. The author says, but if it persists, it could cement a dangerous narrative. The association of Putin's wartime leadership with prosperity and economic growth, and peace with decline and humiliation. After the war, Russia will be left with an economy burdened by structural imbalances and a public disinclined towards sacrifice in the struggle for freedom or reforms. Likely the opposite. Patriotic and extreme voices will call for the army to be built back up again at vast expense. Business profitability is also eroded by rising costs, increased tariffs on rail transport, electricity and gas, as well as higher logistics expenses. Sanctions are not being lowered in 2025, but rather are seen to be intensifying. As a result, resource exports are nearing their limits. Opportunities for technological exports are negligible. Productivity growth is stifled by sanctions. Russia's economic future beyond 2025 looks troubling. Economic growth and low unemployment create the illusion of stability, yet a labour shortage, exhausted production capabilities, and stagnating export revenues suggest a very slow, decades-long recovery. Each month of full-scale war that passes intensifies the pressure. Russians are expected to accept rising inequality and a decline in quality of life, but without the benefits they need to convince themselves that it's a sacrifice worth making. The economy will not be booming. Russia will not be seen as a great world power, and it will not be feared if it loses in Ukraine. Collapse, as happened in the 1990s, is unlikely, says Alexandra Prokopenko. It's likely the Russian government still has resources to maintain a minimal level of order and control, but we are witnessing an irreversible turn towards economic stagnation. Reliance on the military sector and a militarization of the economy and society will lock Russia into a stagnation trap characterized by low growth and chronic internal imbalances, possibly for decades to come. A new report by Russia analyst and former banker Craig Kennedy highlights the huge growth in Russian corporate debt. It has soared by 71% since 2022, dwarfing household and government borrowing. We'll do a follow-up of the episode with a full interview of the author of this report, sharing the extraordinary research data he has compiled on this topic, and indeed it is his data and research and insights that were used in some of the other articles we've read through today, including the piece in the FT.